All right. So last episode, we built an AI automation that researches, optimizes, drafts, and edits resource content for charity golf outings. In doing so, I identified one major and potentially very fatal flaw. I'm not an expert on the topic of running a charity golf outing. So who the hell am I to teach anybody about organizing an event? In this episode, we put automation in place to overcome that hurdle. And it involves tapping into a team of highly qualified experts, PlayThru's existing user base. In other words, I'm going to build automation that asks my users for their insights on different topics, use their replies to improve the quality and value of my content, and in the process, promote and build awareness for the user and their cause. So let's get into how we're going to automate the insight collection process. My name is Keith Mooring, and I am documenting my journey of turning a one-person side hustle into an AI-native business, where AI-powered automations and systems do most of the work. My hope is that the wins and losses along the way serve as a roadmap for other small businesses working to scale and grow in the era of AI. Welcome to episode 5 of the AI Native Attempt. My name is Keith Mooring. If you remember last episode, we built this content automation here. This thing generates charity golf outing resource content. In other words, guides and information and insights on how to run and grow a charity golf outing. This thing goes through and pulls topics from an editorial calendar, uses AI to research that topic, finds keywords to target within the post, pulls resource materials from a shared drive, creates its own subject matter expert on the topic, outlines, drafts, and edits the post as if it's a subject matter expert, applies tone and style, and then saves it all to a shared drive. But along that process, we identified that there is one huge issue that needs to be fixed if I want my content to stand out. I'm not an expert on the topic of running a charity golf outing. I've been a part of them. I've handled different jobs within the process for a number of years for an event that we were doing for my uncle. But I've never done the whole thing. I never had to worry about the financial part, coordinating with the course, soliciting tea gifts, finding sponsors, purchasing food and drink, and so on and so on. And I won't publish AI slop just to get stuff out the door and say I did it. That is not how you win with content today. So I needed a way to get real expertise that I personally do not have. Fortunately for me, I attended a marketing AI conference, Macon, a couple weeks ago. And I sat in a presentation by Will Reynolds from Sierra Interactive. If you haven't had a chance to see him speak in an event, absolutely do it. The stuff he talks about is great. It's wildly insightful. He's very, very smart, but also very funny and very engaging. Just an all-around great speaker. One of the things he explained is how his team built an automation that uses AI to call him and interview him about a topic they want to write about. The AI tool takes down his answers, then spits out his insights on that topic that they then use to write their content. Hearing that alone was worth attending the conference because it unlocked a ton of ideas for me on how to use automation to simplify the process of getting at expert insights. So today I'm going to walk you through the automation that I built to actually use AI and automated systems to ask questions of my user base, pull in their responses, and then feed that directly into the content generation process. All right. So for quick context, let me switch over here to show you what this looks like. So when a user goes into PlayThru to create an account, one of the things that I ask them is, how do you plan to use PlayThru? And there's a variety of different options in here, one of which is tournament, the other of which is fundraiser. Over time, more than 3,300 people have selected fundraiser or tournament. In other words, I have about 3,000 experts who are an email away. So all I just needed to do is come up with an automated way of pulling those insights out of them. Now, this type of system is not as straightforward as it may seem. You just can't send out emails to everyone hoping that you get a bunch of replies, especially with the amount of content that I'm hoping to generate with this automated system. So I had to think through all the different potential pitfalls that it could come up. And here's what I've come up with. One, how do you automate the questions that I need to ask about that specific topic? In other words, how do I make sure that the question aligns with the topic and elicits an open-ended response. Yes, no answers just won't cut it for the type of content that I'm trying to generate. How do I capture the expert responses and then associate that response directly with the correct blog post? If we're sending out requests for, I don't know, 5 different blog posts a week to about 20 to 50 different experts, how do I make sure replies go directly to the correct blog post so I can automate the pool of that information later? How do I make sure the response is tied to a specific expert? I want to give credit where credit is due. And anybody who takes the time of the response to respond and I use their information in the content needs to be called out and cited. And how do I make sure the questions are asked only to those who have opted in, do not want to mess with or email or request information from anyone who doesn't want to participate? And then finally, how can I ensure that the same expert isn't inundated with a bunch of questions, question after question after question? I want to put a little break in between how often I ask people specific questions. I don't want people to get sick of me asking all the time. When you use AI in automation, it doesn't inherently have the judgment and the common sense that a human would. So you have to build that in, which means thinking through all the different ways that this stuff can go terribly, terribly wrong. And it can go terribly, terribly wrong. All right. So before we get into the actual automations, I kind of want to walk through at a very high level how this whole thing is going to work. It all hinges on and focuses on one email address, a dedicated email address called events@golfplaythru.com. This email address is where we are going to send requests out to the experts. And when the experts reply, they will reply to this same email address. And then on the back end, we're going to manage everything, the automation and the AI, and even the person overseeing this process is going to manage everything out of a database. In this case, what I'm going to show you is I've added 2 new tabs to our editorial calendar that control this whole thing. Wait, so let's get into the enhancements we made to the automation and the new stuff that we've built for this. First things first is we need to update the editorial calendar to allow for this new part of the process. And the way the updates we made here, the way they work are the status column. First and foremost, I had to add 2 new statuses to this. In other words, one of them is called research, the other one's called request sent. The way this is ultimately going to work, and this is connected to one of the automations we'll talk about in a second, but if it's marked as research, it's time to send out the request to the experts. As soon as that process is done, request sent is used instead. And then, so I know that that part of the process is done. Automation is going to take care of everything else. Next part here is the blog post ID. This is the unique identifier for this individual piece of content. I didn't get too crazy with this. We don't need to overcomplicate things. Essentially, this is the same thing as the row number. I just use equal sign, here, equal row, open close parentheses, and that number goes right in. Always a good idea once you use a formula like that is to copy, edit, paste special, values only. That gets rid of the formula altogether, but the value stays. But this unique identifier is going to be tied directly to this blog content. The other last column I added here is just more for record keeping of when insights were sent out. So we put a timestamp there just to log that. So that's it on the editorial calendar side, but I added 2 new tabs. So the first one being experts. This is where I'm going to load all 3,300 of my experts into here. It's essentially my CRM for maintaining these relationships. It's going to include their email addresses, which is their unique identifier in this process or in this system. First name, last name, and then the important ones. So opted in is they have replied to my initial request and they have opted in to be an expert. Their status is going to be marked to it. If at any point they opt out, then that status is going to be changed to out, in which case the automation will never email that contact because they have a status of out. The date column. So this is the last time we requested insight from them. And so what I want, the reason this is here is so I don't send multiple requests to the same contact within a couple of days, within a day, within a week. I don't want people to get annoyed by what we're doing here. So we're going to just set it for, at least initially, we'll see how this works out, but every 30 days, they're then eligible to be included in a request again. And then I also want to log the last question we asked the contact. we're actually going to pull this back in when they reply to the email, if they reply. So we'll have record of what we asked them most recently. And then we have a response count. So at the end of the day, I'd love to celebrate and help promote, do something special for those that reply most often. So just having a log of how often people reply will be helpful with when we get into that side of things. And then the last tab here, the last new tab, this one is specifically for logging the replies with the insights. So we have the post ID, which again lines up directly with the post ID over here. So we know exactly what post this references, who the expert is, again, that unique identifier, what was the last question they were asked, and then based on how they replied to the email, we'll pull their insight directly into this tab here. So that's really the long and short of the updates we made to the database. That's how we're going to control and manage everything. The automation is going to utilize this information to manage the full execution of the actual automations. Okay, so let's get into the actual automation itself, the first of the two new automations. So this one's called Insight Email Sorter. Sorry for the name. At a very high level, the way this works is it's going to monitor an email address, events@golfplaythru.com, categorize anything that comes in, and then do the next appropriate action as we've defined and described here. So getting into more detail though, this is the inbox it's monitoring. Anything new coming in here is going to go and be seen by this trigger. And it's going to pull in the subject line, the sender, a whole bunch of information about that specific email that came in. And then the first thing we're going to do is send it over to this AI tool, this OpenAI one, and categorize it into one of four buckets. The first one being if the person replies to an email and your insights is in the subject line. That's going to be the first email we send out to this full list. It's going to have your insights directly in the subject line there. And if they reply in a positive way, like, yes, they're agreeing to be an expert, we're going to categorize it into the opt-in bucket. The opt-out bucket is going to trigger when the subject line may vary, but if at any point someone says, I want out, I don't want to do this anymore, we're going to group them into that bucket and then take the next action. There's the response bucket. So we sent them a request or a question and they replied to it with their insights. So what we're looking for there is insights in the subject line. The subject line is going to be important with this whole process because we're using a specific naming convention to make sure we bucket each of the replies the right way. But in this case, a response is going to have, hopefully they reply to the email itself, but it's going to have insights in the subject line along with the ID number of that piece of content. And then we have a catch-all. Anything that doesn't fall in those three needs to be forwarded on to someone to review it and make sure that the next appropriate thing actually happens the way it should. So that's where this other bucket comes in. And then we'll feed it the subject line and the email body, and then have it return back only the name of the category it finds. So once we get that though, now it's going to go down one of four paths based on the category the AI decided that would fall into. So the first one being opt-in. So the first thing we're going to do is, in this case, we're going to go into the experts tab and look for the email address of the person who sent the email. If we find it, then our next step is to hop out of that and then go down one of two routes. If we did find the email, we're going to update the editorial calendar appropriate, specifically the experts tab. So we identified the Google Sheet, the sheet name, and the row number, of which we found by searching the database for that expert. And then we're going to update column D, which is that opt-in column, to be it. And that's really it. That's all that we need to do there. If we don't find the email, we want to make sure that we're still logging that expert, just figuring out why they weren't logged or weren't referenced the way that we had them in the expert column. So in that case, we're going to forward the email off to someone who could take care and manage that process. So that's the opt-in part. Opt-out part works very similar. So if the email comes in, categorizes as opt-out, what we're going to do is search the experts tab for the sender. If we find it, we're going to update that individual's status to out. And then if we don't find it, again, we want to make sure that we are logging that information. So it goes off to the email of someone who can take it and do what they need to do with it. I'm going to skip response real quick. The other one, so if catch-all gets tagged for that email, what we're going to do here is just forward off the email to someone who could do something about it. So in this case, insights, other response, and then it actually goes right to me, but then I'm going to just copy the body of the email directly in there and then send that off. So we don't need to process it beyond alerting someone to who knows what to do to do something with it. And then so finally, the last step here is the response side. So if we do get a response back, the first thing that this thing has to do, the AI has to do, is it needs to extract what that insight actually is. So give it a goal, give it a role, give it the context, so subject line and email body. But we wanted to extract actually three main things, and we should probably spell things in here, right? Okay. So the first thing is using the subject line, find the ID of the blog post that was referenced. And so we're going to go grab that information, provide context, provide examples, what to look for. Again, this is where the naming convention really comes in handy because we have the hashtag in there. It'll follow insights. So we know exactly what to look for. The insights body, ask it to review, ignore the citations, and then extract any sort of feedback from that section. And then the other thing that we want it to do is if at any point they provide any information or feedback about the product. I've sent emails out before asking for specific things. And sometimes I'll get requests for, hey, can it do this? Or can we do this? They use as an opportunity to get more insight about how to use the product. So I want to make sure those are taken care of also. So in this case, I'm sending back a structured object, a JSON object, and I'm labeling it as blog ID, insights, and then product. And then I'm going to dump each of those flag things directly into this structure. And then this JSON object is going to set it up and create three separate variables out of that, which I can then use later on for these automations here. So that's really the end of the AI stuff, because now it's just formatting and processing the data itself. So the first thing we're going to do is look for the expert who sent the email in our experts database and pull in that row's worth of information. If we find the expert, if that expert does exist, this is where my filter kicks in. And so if the number of bundles in this Google Sheet is greater than 0, it's going to first off, going to jump into the Insights tab and update that tab accordingly. So in column A, I'm going to put the ID of the blog post. I'm going to put the email address that I found and associated with it in my experts tab. I'm going to pull in from that experts tab that last question answer. We have that same information right here in column F. So we're pulling this whole row, but grabbing that information and feeding that into the Insights tab. And then we're going to pull in the insights itself. So what was extracted by the AI tool will be fed here into this variable. And again, with the variable stuff, if you just click here, I know we've probably showed this a couple of times if you've seen previous videos, but you can see blog ID, insights, and product are all pulled in here as individual data points. And all I have to do is click and drop it right in there. And then the last step here, I figured I would just add it here is if there is any sort of notes about the product, I'm just going to drop it into this column E. And that way that information gets logged into a database. It doesn't go into the ether and I can actually do something with it. So I'll hit save there. And then because we did get our insight and we want to keep track of who and how many of our people are sending back, we have this tab here, which again goes back into the experts tab, finds the specific row for that expert, and we update column G with in other words, we're increasing the count on the number of times they've responded. So we're taking this value. So this formula here is the sum. We're going to take that value plus 1. And what I get on the other side is 2. If for whatever reason we didn't find the expert associated with this response, we still need to log it. And what we're going to do is a little different. Instead of, so we'll have the email of the person who replied, but in column C, since we don't have the question, we're just going to put in here, no expert found. So we can log and make sure that we know, okay, this insight was not associated with a specific expert, but we still want the expert insight in there. And then we're going to go on to the second of the new automations. Okay, so this is the second of the 2 new automations, the editorial calendar, the insight requester. And the way this one works is, again, it works very similar to the editorial calendar, where the first thing we're going to do is check that editorial calendar for the status of research. If it sees that status, it's going to pull in that row's worth of information. And then we're going to pass that information on to this first of AI tools. And we're going to feed it the context of who are you, article premise, here's your topic, here's your talking points, and then give it some specific instructions on how to come up with a question that's one, simple, easy to understand, doesn't overcomplicate the topic, but also create something that's open ended that will allow the person who receives it to say, okay, it's not a yes or no question. It's something I have to put a little thought and it's a little explanation in. And then I'm going to send that back in a structured format because I need to drop that question into an email down the road. So we're going to send it back as Q1 and that email comes in. Down the road, if we wanted to, we could potentially add additional questions here, but I wanted to keep it simple with the first version of it. So that comes in. Again, this GSART is extremely helpful when OpenAI or any AI tool sends back a structured object. You need something like this to make sure that it comes in as the proper form. But once we've got the email, now we need to write it. So we're going to send it off to another AI tool. Here's who you are. Here's your goal. But this is key. HTML formatted email. It needs to be HTML formatted to be able to send out of Google or Gmail in a structured, easy to read way. So we've got that. Here's our inputs, article focus and topics. Here's the specific question. Here's who I am. And here's the requirements. So greetings. Hey, thanks. Appreciate you doing this regularly for us. Here's the topic we're writing about. Here's the specific question we need. Please answer it as best you can. If there's other thing in here and other things in here you worth mentioning or calling out, please include those as well. And then always mention ending with the opt-out clause. If you don't want to receive these anymore, please let us know. But always being a very positive, appreciative, thankful form and tone. So again, just some additional information. Use HTML, Markdown, call out, use lists, so a strong bold text where you can. So you've got all that stuff built into it. Let me see if there's anything else in here. Okay, good. There's nothing else there. Once the email's written, we're going to go down one of two paths. First and foremost, we're going to try to find the right experts we need to send this to. So we're going to go searching for experts, specifically for if a contact has had opted in and last contacted is today's date minus 1 month. And so based on that, we're going to try to pull in 5, maybe 10 records. Again, we'll play with this to see how many we get back on a regular basis, but we're pull in a specific number of records. Now we have 5 of those records. The reason I have this part here separated from here is because if I pull in 5 new records, these operations here are going to run one time for each of those 5 records because I haven't grouped them back up into one small unit. First expert, go through, second expert, third expert, so on and so forth. So you want to separate that branch out against the one over here that I only want to run the one time. So, but for each expert, then we're going to go down one of two paths. If there are experts found, we're going to build and then send off an email. So what's their email address, event insights number, and then my post ID. Again, remember the naming convention is important here because that's how we're going to identify the reply with the request. Put the topic in there and then feed in the HTML. Hi, first name with the paragraph markers, and then our structured or formatted HTML email, which comes from this module right here. And then I also BCC'd myself on this. And the reason being, so I can keep tabs on what information is sent out and how it looks and how it reads. Because if for whatever reason it's coming out as garbage, I need to make sure that I address that and fix that as soon as possible. So I'm going to be emailed or CC'd on all of these. If for whatever reason down the road, I have someone managing this whole process, they will be put in charge of making sure that those emails go out and are always formatted and read properly. So we'll save there. If for whatever reason, we can't find any experts, we've run out or we've tapped into everybody we have, then we're going to go down this road and we're going to update the editorial calendar sheet, update the row, set request as sent, but then update column H, which is obviously way over here where we're logging our timestamp, no experts found. That way we know, and we can just move on with the content generation without waiting around for people to reply. Once that runs for each of the identified experts, last step here, is we're going to update the editorial calendar again, mark it as request sent, and set the timestamp here to now. It is worth noting that I have in here a section so that if no experts were found and we do come in here and update the editorial calendar with request set, we don't need to do it a second time. And so this variable here, what I mark is end, and it's set to end. Essentially, this is the variable name. This is what I'm setting it to. And then I'm going to pull that variable back in here, grab end, and then I'm going to filter for it. If end equals end, don't go further. If it doesn't, then proceed, and then we'll update the editorial calendar appropriately. Last and final step here is with the 2 new automations created, the editorial updated, what I need to do now is make sure that the content generation tool is set up to pull in any relevant insights and use it when it's writing its content. So I jump into the automation that we built last time. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see there's a new step right here. So what we're doing is going into that insights tab of the editorial calendar, looking for the post ID. And again, when this thing runs on the first time, it runs for and grabs the entire row. So when this is set to draft, for example, it's going to grab the entire row, which includes the post ID. So back here in the automation, what we can do is filter this on any insights, which would be in this insights tab with the post of that post ID. And if it finds any, it's going to grab all of those rows. So in this case, I have the limit set to 5. This will probably be right in line with how many requests I send out. So if I update one, I'll probably update both. But what we're going to do is pull in all of those rows, and then we're going to group them all into a CSV file. This will allow us to pass the data into an AI tool without having it separated as individual bundles. In other words, unless I group it here, the rest of these steps are going to run each time for each insight found, which obviously we don't want. We want them grouped into a small bundle, which is why the CSV file exists. We're going to pass that off to these 2 modules in particular. So the first one being the outline. So all I did was I came down here, very similar to what it was before, but I added this new section here, user expert insights. You've interviewed existing users who have experience. Here are their insights. And then I'm going to call that out later in the post itself. Like when you're writing, make sure you reference the user insights. Same exact thing. I literally copied and pasted it into the draft section where I'm user insights, and then made sure to call out the fact that use the user insights when drafting to add value and depth to the piece of content. So that was obviously clearly a lot. I hope that was easy enough to follow, but the idea, if we're going to sum it all up, is we're using one email address tied to automation to send out and then process anything that comes back. And then core updating our editorial calendar appropriate with the stuff that it pulls back from. And then once we get that information, we're feeding it right into that content generation process. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was easy to follow. It did seem like a lot. It's obviously a longer video. If you have any questions, let me know. Obviously, put comments. I'd love any feedback or the additional thoughts on how to enhance what I've built directly in the comments on YouTube, or send them to me via email. I'd appreciate it. But next time, plan is we're going to tackle image generation. I have a very unique style with the images I like to use for the PlayThru blog content. I'm going to see if I can't use AI to help me match and build out those versions of it instead of having to go into Canva and create them that way. So hopefully stay tuned. Hope you stick around, and thanks for watching. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to follow along the journey and get the resources and automation downloads I'm building, head over to ainativeattempt.com and subscribe. As always, if you have any questions or thoughts on how to improve the automation I'm building, please leave a comment. I'd love to see them. And please share and like this video if you found the content